I, 22, female, am the legal owner of the house that I grew up in after my mother left it to me. I inherited this house from her when she passed away last year at the age of 47 from a stroke. It was sudden, but I've made my peace with it now. My parents got divorced when I was 7 years old and had joint custody of me, so I'd spend half the month with my dad and the other half with my mother. I'd have to say I was a lot closer to my mother because she'd just get me. And my dad, 50, male, was always a little too busy for me, and I felt like I never had his full attention because it was either work or women for him. I don't think he ever treated me as a priority as such, but I was okay with it, as long as I had Mom. A couple of years back, right after I turned 18 and started college, my dad decided to move to Houston for work, so we started seeing less of each other, and we'd only meet around the holidays. 2 years ago, he brought along his girlfriend at the time, Julia, 38, female, with him to celebrate Christmas with us. She also brought her 2 daughters, 18 female and 16 female, from her previous relationship with her high school boyfriend. They'd never been married, but they had broken up about 7 years prior to when she started seeing my dad. That was quite a surprise for us because my father had never brought any girlfriends with him to family dinners, but we gave Julia and her kids the warmest welcome we possibly could and did our best to make her feel comfortable around us. It was an evening well spent, and I'd say that all of us got along really well at the time. Even after that, whenever I talked to my dad on the phone, Julia would also say hi and be really sweet to me. Her kids were kind of shy and introverted, so they mostly kept to themselves, but overall, we had a good relationship. After my mother passed away, I found out that she'd left the house to me. Thankfully, for some reason, my mother had divided all her assets in the will around my 18th birthday because she always liked to think ahead, even in morbid situations like these. Anyway, since I had just graduated, I decided to move in and find a job that wouldn't require me to move out anytime soon. I wanted to spend the next couple of years in my childhood home just because it was my place of comfort. My father wasn't too pleased with my mom's decision, and he made sure that I knew about it after he found out about the will. He and Julia had been very sweet and supportive around the time of the funeral, but my dad had been a little morose when he realized he wasn't getting the house back. This house was the one that my parents had purchased together back when they first got married, but my mother took over during the divorce. It was a fair deal because he got out of paying alimony even though my mother had given up her career to stay home and raise me so that my dad could focus on his job. So I believe that my mother taking the house in the settlement and letting my dad go without alimony was completely fair. She worked her way up afterwards with a little help from her parents and even made sure that I never felt sidelined or unimportant. She did both jobs well, and I didn't think it was fair for my dad to be annoyed that he didn't get the house back. He didn't talk about it much, but I could sense from his behavior that he wasn't pleased with that. I didn't care at the time because I was still grieving my mother, and my dad being annoyed at her will was the least of my worries. She'd left all her wedding jewelry to him and all the gifts he'd given her as well, so that should have been enough for him. He went back to Houston with Julia a few weeks after the funeral, and since then I've been living on my own here. However, about 6 months ago, my dad told me that he was now engaged to Julia, and he wanted to get married where his home was. So he was coming back here for the weeks leading up to the wedding, because staying in a hotel when there was a house with enough spare rooms just didn't make sense. Their daughters were also homeschooled, so they wouldn't have a problem with schools either. I agreed with him, so I agreed to let them all move into my house and stay with me before the wedding for a couple of reasons. I was sick of living on my own, and I did get along well with Julia, so I didn't think there was anything wrong with letting them live with me. My dad had also promised to split all the bills with me while they were living here, which meant that I didn't have to worry about overspending on that either. And so they moved in here with me about a month ago and have been staying here since then. It was nice having them here, and I felt a lot less lonely than I used to earlier when I was living by myself, and believed that I could get used to this. I was even dreading the day they would all leave and go back to their normal lives, because that would mean I'd have to resume my normal life by myself as well. But then 2 weeks ago, 3 days before the wedding, my dad sat me down and asked me if I'd be willing to let them all move back here permanently. I didn't see that coming at all, but he explained that he'd come back here to make me feel a little more comfortable with the idea of being part of a family and living with them, since he didn't like the idea of me living all alone in this house. He'd planned to ease me into it, and now that he thought I was getting along well, he wanted to know if I'd be willing to turn this into a permanent thing. I wanted to say yes immediately, but then his behavior when he'd learned that he wasn't getting the house back kind of threw me off. As much as I would have loved to make it a permanent arrangement, I didn't think it was such a good idea so soon, and I didn't want to make the mistake of acting on my emotions. I knew that this was the only logical solution to my overwhelming feelings of loneliness. But that didn't mean I absolutely had to let them all move in here with me. And it had just been a month that they'd been living here. So as much as I wanted to say yes, I ended up telling him that I needed some time to think. It was a gut feeling, but I just knew for some reason that it would be in my best interest to give this some time and not make a rash decision. I kept my personal feelings aside and told him that I'd inform him about my decision after the wedding. He looked annoyed, but didn't push it. 10 days ago, they finally got married, and we had a total blast at their wedding. They were supposed to stay here for a couple more days after the wedding and then move back, so I was preparing to let them know about my decision, which was a yes. But before I could get to that, all of them took off on their honeymoon without even telling me about it. 2 days after their wedding, I woke up to find myself completely on my own, and they'd all left, but a lot of their belongings were still at my house. So I decided to make some calls, but nobody responded for quite a while, and I continued to panic about it. I'd planned on telling them about my decision that day itself, but I couldn't even reach them for hours. Finally, around noon, Julia got back to me and informed me very casually that they'd all left for their honeymoon and wouldn't be back for a week. I was stunned because I'd obviously expected them to at least tell me about their plans before just taking off, if not include me. I was offended that they didn't ask me, but I didn't want to be petty, so I started off by asking her why had nobody told me about any of this. And she gave me a lame excuse saying that they'd forgotten to inform me, but told me not to worry because they'd be back soon. I tried to explain to her that that wasn't the point at all, and my problem was that they just left without a word or even a goodbye, and that was rude of them. I said that I wanted to speak to my dad, but that's when her tone changed, and she said that my dad was busy and didn't have the time to speak to me. I still tried to keep my cool and told her to let me know whenever he had time so I could get in touch with him directly. And I said it politely, but she turned on me. And all of a sudden, she'd gone from this sweet person to a really snarky and mean stepmom. She told me that my dad was going to be busy for the next couple of days and asked me not to bother them. Even though it wasn't necessary at all because I hadn't brought it up, she went on to tell me that there was no need for me to act so hysterically, just because I'd been left behind and felt the need to remind me that I wasn't a child anymore. My dad had a new family now, so I needed to make my peace with it, and by the time they came back home, she wanted me to get over myself and get the house clean for them. Now, I don't know who she thought she was talking to, but she sure as hell wasn't going to be talking to me like that. She hung up right after saying that, and my anger was literally out of the roof. I decided not to call my dad after that, and thanked the universe for not letting me agree to his suggestion before I'd seen this side of his new wife. There was no way in hell that they were living with me anymore, so I personally packed all their belongings up as haphazardly and badly as I could stuffed them in a couple of cardboard boxes and left them in the yard for them to find whenever they chose to come back. I didn't care what became of those things because they didn't belong to me, and neither did they belong inside a house that was mine. After that, it was life as usual for me, and I tried not to think about the betrayal that I'd felt because of what my dad had done for no real reason. Yesterday, they finally came back from their honeymoon, and luckily I was at work when they found all their stuff in the yard. I'd also changed the locks on the door in the meantime so they couldn't get in either. And my dad was extremely pissed off when he contacted me about it. He told me that I was being a brat and overreacting because to them, deserting me at home without notice is not something worth getting mad over, and they did nothing wrong. I just told him to take their boxes and leave, and if I saw them on my property when I came back home, I'd call the police. He cursed at me and then hung up, but I had to get back to work and couldn't waste my time worrying about that. When I got home after work, I noticed that they'd taken their things and left, and I thought that this was the end of it. But the most annoying bit was yet to come, because around midnight, my dad called me up and told me that Julia had something to say to me. She told me that she was sorry about the way she spoke to me and that she took it all back. She'd love to have a second shot at making amends with me, and she didn't want to be on bad terms with me over something so petty. I told her to shut the hell up and leave me alone because I didn't need her fake apologies. I'm not a fool, and I could tell why she suddenly wanted to play happy family now that I wasn't going to let them live with me anymore. If she had any regrets, she wouldn't have waited for so long to realize that she'd messed up and would have apologized right after the phone call that day, or even during her vacation for that matter. I'm sure my dad isn't sorry either. But when he realized that I wasn't going to forgive them, he decided to go all sentimental on me and told me that I was being heartless by not allowing them to live with me. He said that he was willing to split all the bills with me if I let him move back in, but he wanted to live in this house since it reminds him of my mother. So it would be really selfish of me to kick them out like this without thinking of what the repercussions of that might be, because he'd only come back to feel closer to my mother, apparently. He even said that Julia had just been in a bad mood that day and didn't mean anything she said, and even her kids missed me. So they wanted me to allow them to come back and let them have a fresh start here. But I wasn't having any of it. I'd always known that my dad had his eye on this house ever since the divorce, and now that I'd seen this side of Julia, I didn't want to risk anything. So I told him that they could go back home because I wasn't changing my mind. And then, out of nowhere, my dad started bawling his eyes out on the phone and accused me of being the most selfish daughter ever because I couldn't even let him live in the house he'd spent the happiest days of his life in over a silly little disagreement that I'd had with Julia, and because they hadn't taken me with them on their honeymoon, which wasn't even the whole reason. He said that I was being petty and mean and that my mother would hate this ugly side of mine. AITA for not letting my dad and his new family move back in with me after his new wife was rude to me and they didn't ask me to accompany them on their honeymoon vacation. Update 1. So the comments on my original post were definitely a reality check. I don't think some of you all needed to be that rude about it, but I get the point that everyone was trying to make for the most part. I stuck to my decision and didn't let my dad move back in because, very frankly, he just doesn't deserve it. He's been nothing but awful to me so far, and I don't need any more of that in my life. It was nice while it lasted because both he and Julia were very sweet to me initially, but once I told my dad that I still needed time to think, their real colors started to show. They probably ran out of patience and thought that they could intimidate me into letting them live with me, but unfortunately, I'm not that weak. I'd rather be lonely than end up spending my time with the wrong people. I shouldn't have let them come here at all because his reaction when he learned that the house's ownership had been transferred to me and not him should have been enough for me to realize how materialistic and selfish people can be when it comes down to it. As for Julia, I'm glad that she chose to pick a nonsensical fight with me and ended up messing things up for herself on a grand scale because had she not said that, we would have all been a happy family now. Or I guess we could have been, but that will never happen because I'm not falling for their fake behavior again. I was lonely. I missed my mom, and all my grandparents had passed on already, so I needed a family to be my support system. But these people are definitely not up for that job, and I'm relieved that I realized that before it was too late. It's been a couple of days since they left, but my dad's been calling me regularly and keeps texting me because I'm not answering his calls. He thinks that I should at least give them one last chance at fixing things, but they don't deserve it. They blew their one chance, and if I give them another one, I'm sure they'll blow it too, and that will backfire on me more than anyone else, so it doesn't make sense to take that risk. I feel bad that I'm treating my dad like this, but there's not much I can do in such a situation. You reap what you sow, and in his case, he never bothered to put in much of an effort with me, so he doesn't get to complain when he realizes that I'm not going to make life decisions based around him and his feelings. But he never did that for me. Update 2. So apparently my dad's not just insistent, but he's pretty desperate to move in. Guess why? Because he didn't take a break from his job like he'd claimed to. He'd been fired a couple of months ago before his wedding and had been living off of his savings so far, which was plenty. But now, after an extravagant wedding and a lavish honeymoon, he'd finally told Julia that they couldn't afford to go back once again and try their luck in Houston because he wouldn't be able to afford rent there. And Julia had quit her job to be a stay-at-home mom after she met my dad, so she couldn't help. So now they needed to find a place here, and my dad had just assumed that I let them live with me. Julia had no idea about any of this until he told her the truth, which is why she even bothered to apologize. So I was right about her not having any real regrets about her behavior. She's as fake as it gets, but that's the kind of wife my dad deserves anyway. He contacted me today and requested me to let them move in just a couple of days until he's able to find a proper job that pays well enough for him to be able to afford to move out. But I told him that I was going to do no such thing. They'd been nasty to me, and I didn't need that kind of negativity around me. He's a grown man. He should have known that if he didn't have a job, then he shouldn't have had such an expensive wedding followed by an equally fancy honeymoon. I understand the need to show that you're wealthy, but that's only for people who can actually afford it and not for men with a stay-at-home wife and 2 teenage stepdaughters. He was well aware of his responsibilities, but he chose to ignore them, and that is not my fault, and I refuse to feel guilty for putting myself above him. They can sort things out for themselves because none of this is my problem anymore. I texted him back and told him the same things that I said here, but tried to be a little more polite than I was here because I didn't want to come off as someone who was mocking him or whatever. But he chose to take it as a mockery of what he was going through and told me that I'd have to suffer for what I was doing to him. I don't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond to him because no matter what I say at this point, he's going to find a way to turn it around on me and blame me for it. So it's better to just not say anything and let him wallow in his misery. It's hardly my problem now. Update 3. My dad decided to leave the city today, but why would he ever leave without letting me know what a huge letdown I am as a daughter? He could have left silently, but he is who he is, and so is his wife, so they chose to make a whole thing of it. I last spoke to him about 3 weeks ago, but I didn't check up on him after that, and neither did he bother to reach out to me. But today, he and Julia both sent me texts saying that they were delighted to inform me that Julia's ex-boyfriend had decided to sponsor their trip back home and was even going to let them all back because he'd suddenly realized that he needed to see his daughters too. Julia had full custody of her daughters and her ex did pay child support, but he was always a little too busy to make time for his kids. He'd waited long enough for Julia and my dad to sort their situation out on their own, but when he realized that they were useless, he offered to clean up their mess himself, which is great for his daughters, I guess. At least some dads do step up even if it's too late. They didn't tell me all of this, but I know this could have been the only possible explanation because they did post a picture of their daughters a couple of hours ago, captioning it with "Our lucky charms" and a 4-leaf clover sticker. So I'm smart enough to know what the real story behind Julia's ex's sudden epiphany might be and why he's funding their trip back home. I don't understand why exactly he'd sponsor all their flight tickets, but I think Julia's manipulation and stubbornness might have had something to do with that. I know for sure she does have that streak. I've seen it firsthand in the past. I don't know exactly what went down, but I'm just relieved that they're leaving and this is the last I'll have to see of them. I've also realized how easy I had it after I went through some stories that people shared here about their crazy families. Rest assured, my dad is a little too worried about his reputation to even try and harm me in any way whatsoever, because he knows I'm not going to hesitate in calling the cops on him. Even if he does, I have enough training to know how to defend myself, so there's no need for me to worry. And now that they're leaving, there's even less of a reason for me to even think about them at all. So yay for me, I guess. I still do feel a little lonely sometimes, but instead of moping about it, I now go to my friends instead, because I think that's a better route to take when it comes to things like these. I completely shut everyone out after my mom passed away, and I hadn't even realized how alone I'd become until I read the comments here. It's going to take a while, but I'm going to try and make the best of my life now, because I do have a stable job. I make a decent income and I have my own house, which is not something a lot of people my age have, and I'm really grateful to my mom for it. I have great friends who care about me, and honestly, what more does a person need? And if I get into trouble again, I'll just come back here, and I'm sure the wonderful people of Reddit are going to bail me out once again. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.